Dan, thank you so much for joining us here at Interconnect. You are a long-term subscriber, and I thank you for all the support you have given the channel and the time you've taken on multiple occasions now to make this conversation work. So thank you for that. Welcome to Interconnect. How are you today?
I'm well. Thanks for having me, Ollie.
So, in our correspondence during the preamble to this recording, you said something that really struck a chord with me, and that is conspiracy theory is like religion, but for depressed people.
Yes.
Now, the whole idea of this discussion was inspired by a common narrative that spreads through truther and conspiracy channels on YouTube, and your comment absolutely hit the nail on the head. Now, these channels and movements seem to thrive off the idea that the occult is satanic, is evil, and that quote-unquote magic practice is used by powerful elites to enslave mankind. I am paraphrasing, but you get the idea. Now, I've digested quite a lot of both occult and conspiracy information, and I find some discrepancy here. The truther movement, conspiracy movement, is really depressing. Like you say, everything's doom and gloom. We're trapped in hell. Don't go outside because the apocalypse is just around the corner. It's best if you just stay in and watch more of my videos. So we hear an enormous amount about solar cults, Luciferianism, Freemasonry from those truther channels, but very little as to actually how to improve one's life or get out of the matrix, to use a cliche. When we look at esoterica, the opposite's true. There's a whole swathe of literature on self-improvement, altruism, transcendence, compassion. My own practice has undoubtedly made me a better person and led me to grow and shed both addictive and destructive behaviour traits, which leads me to question the agenda of these so-called truthers. Do they want to help people change, improve, emancipate themselves and know truth, or are they simply there to depress and disempower with empty, hopeless rhetoric? So I wanted to get you on, as one of the foremost authorities on history, mysticism and the occult, to talk us through some of the more popular memes that we see emanating from the rabbit hole of YouTube for people that are looking and searching for truth. So firstly, please, can you give us a quick history lesson as to the connection that magic has to science?
Right. So, I mean, this is a difficult question to answer in a way that is brief, but I would say that it's probably easier to tell you when science and magic became disentangled, because for so long they were one and the same thing. It was during the Enlightenment that sort of old notions of magical thinking, things like sympathetic resonances and that sort of astrological dimension of natural philosophy, all that was being shed. This is where you get the split or the divorce between alchemy and chemistry. Alchemy falling largely out of favor because it had been overrun by frauds who were looking to make a quick buck by getting their patron to fund them to find the Philosopher's Stone. I don't want to paint them too negatively, though, because they also did a lot of science, right? So alchemists were in the forefront, let's say, in the Holy Roman Empire, of mining operations, of metallurgical research, and also even weapons manufacturing and these sorts of things. So it's not so easy to say when magic stops being science, but I would say that around the Enlightenment we get a gradual sort of disillusionment with the traditional magic worldview of the Middle Ages, which had been inherited from the Greco-Roman world before it.
So what kind of time period are we talking about when you say the Enlightenment?
Well, we're talking about 18th century chiefly. I mean, starting in the 17th century, very much so, but culminating in the 18th century. And then that would give way to sort of romanticism that would bring back a lot of interest in the foreign, the exotic, and, of course, the occult. And romanticism would be sort of the main lifeline into Victorian occultism, the revival of Victorian occultism. And that is, in large part, at the root of the occult, let's say, revival of the 20th century.
And the Western esoteric tradition would come under that umbrella.
Right. I mean, the Western esoteric tradition is very long and convoluted and has Celsus in there, you can Agrippa in there, you can put Marsilio Ficino and Giordano Bruno and all of these people who are definitely not Victorian era occultists. But these are people who, they're the tradition, they're the canon, they're the people that other people would go to get an understanding of that sort of lost ancient wisdom of medieval magic.
So it really, I mean, if to give our listeners an understanding, so really the two were quite heavily entwined for quite some time, science and magic, because the origins have got to be, for Hermetic thought, pre-Christ at least. So
Right.
what are we looking at as a timescale for them being linked before they diverged?
What I should say is that it's the division, the divergence is in our heads. It's an artificial one. It's kind of like a label that we impose from the outside in. Science, what it is that science had a changing definition. So science to the ancient world didn't mean empiricism. It didn't mean the collection of data in order to prove hypotheses, that sort of thing. It wasn't the scientific method. What we were looking at was scientia in Latin, where the word science comes from, means knowledge. So it was the collective body of knowledge of the world. I mean, largely of your language, but whatever had been translated into your language. So say Greek, whatever most people were reading in Greek in the ancient world. And so they were translating all manner of scientific, magical, philosophical, natural philosophical, which is what we call science today. All of these things were being translated into Greek. And so you would read all of this stuff and get a complete vision of the world. And then you would say, okay, that's science. That's the collective body of human understanding. It wasn't a method like it is today. Now, it was during the Enlightenment that came about, that scientific method was developed in order to differentiate the new sort of science, the new kind of mode of understanding from that old kind of dusty, curmudgeonly, academic tradition of Aristotelian scholasticism, of sort of reconciling new discoveries with old traditions. And it was always about reconciling with tradition. And this new mode wanted to break away from that entirely. So it created a system for itself. And then we had two different meanings for the word science. We had science, the method, and then we had science, which was still the old meaning of the word, the body of understanding. And we still kind of have a holdover of this when we say, like, oh, this is science, like, this is fact, this is science. Like, that means to say, not that I have, like, tested this and probed this through experimentation and I know it to be true. What you're saying is somebody else has and I'm taking their word for it.
I see.
So it's the changing definitions that we have to think of, and when that happened, more so than when magic and science actually became divorced from one another, because in some ways they never became divorced, and in some ways, they remain legitimate intellectual pursuits. I think of the Large Hadron Collider. In the 50s, they shot, I think it was beryllium, an atom of beryllium at 70% the speed of light, and smashed it into lead, and they created gold. And so, just like that, they actually realized the dreams of all the alchemists, that all is one thing, and they didn't even think of it in those terms. But, or we went to space, that sort of stuff. Like,
yeah. I think it's really interesting that you mentioned that artificial divergence, and it looks to me as though there's been a real push to make magic and the occult a forbidden art. Could you give us your sort of insights into that? Why did it become a forbidden art? Who's sort of pushing that agenda?
Well, this has a lot to do with the occult's intertwinement with philosophy. And philosophy, obviously, was deemed by the medieval church to be the handmaid of theology. And now, I would say around the time of Giordano Bruno, we have kind of a reimagining of how this system works. And it wasn't so much that philosophy should be a handmaid to theology, but rather that philosophy is in and of itself a legitimate and let's say, enlightening pursuit. And now, when you say that, what you're doing is you're saying that my own personal rational intellect is more authoritative or superior to the collective body of knowledge that of the society that I participate in. And that the guardians of that society, which was the Catholic Church at the time, couldn't suffer that, because that would just, all of society would...
Heresy!
Right. That's why you burn the heretic, because it's like a disease that like spreads to other people, and then their souls wind up going to hell because we didn't take care of the flock well enough. So we need to take these people who think that their own rational intellect is superior to that of the collective church's rational intellect. The Catholic Church was always sort of against rationalism, obviously, because they knew deep down inside that humans love to worship their own creations. And so they thought that if you got too heavily invested into rationalism, you would start to... It's sort of like becoming too involved in yoga. The body becomes an idol. Well, in this case, it's like reason becomes its own idol. But in any case, that's the Catholic Church, right? Like that's their point of view. But that they're a critical an actor in the history of how philosophy and magic and all of these things interplay, because they were the opponent, so to speak, in the tennis game.
Yes. I mean, we see Catholic priests, and a lot of the ceremonies and rites are essentially magic rituals, as far as my understanding goes. And
they are, for sure.
You see is it the fish hat that the Pope wears?
Yeah, the mitre hat.
Harps back to the days of the... You'll have to help me out here. The Babylonian
priests.
Fishman. Yeah. So, would that lead us to say that all of our religion today stems from Babylonian times? Would that be a fair assessment?
No, I don't think so. I think that Babylon has had a very integral and central role in many of the religions of the West. I don't think Babylon really has anything to do, with Hinduism. I don't think Babylon really has much to do with Taoism or Buddhism or even Protestantism or something like that. So I wouldn't say that everything harkens back to Babylonian, mystery tradition. I think that this is one of these things that is plays into conspiratorial thinking, where people pick 2 points, and they pick just 2 arbitrary points, and then they draw a line directly through it. And that applies to everything, right? Like, that applies to pyramids on like, when you pick 2 points and you draw a line through them, that's you're arbitrarily connecting dots, and that's fine. Like, you can do that. You're constructing meaning for yourself, but you can also do that to the point where you become schizophrenic. And I think that to attribute everything to Babylonian, or I think often it's attributed to Phoenician. So they're always talking about Baal worship or the worship of Baal, which is more Phoenician than it is Babylonian. The equivalent in Babylon would be Marduk. And so they have, in the Phoenician tradition, they have Baal and they also have Moloch, and these are gods that appear in the Bible. And now, what I think a lot of people tend to forget is that a lot of conspiratorial thinking comes out of the American South. And the American South is inextricably intertwined in its worldview with evangelical Christianity. And evangelical Christianity polarizes. It sees things in black and white. And this sort of way of looking at things, and I don't want to, throw everybody under the bus, but it definitely tinges the narrative of how people think about events, because they're always framing things within that frame of reference. So, for example, let's say modern Moloch worship, burning children to owls or something like that. The reason people think that this is a thing is because they read it in the Bible. The Bible is full of stories about human sacrifices to pagan deities, and that Israel sets itself apart from its neighbors in that it doesn't do that. This story goes back to Abraham and Isaac, where Abraham is supposed to sacrifice Isaac just because God asks him to. And so he says, I'm going to do it. And then finally God says, no, don't do it. I'm going to provide a substitute, a scapegoat. And so you don't have to sacrifice people anymore. I'm not like those Phoenician gods. Well, so then all of Jewish history from that point on is full of, let's say, slander against their neighbors in order to differentiate themselves. And the Romans would do the same against the Carthaginians. And we just don't know. We don't totally have the evidence that this was a practice that they did. But if you're a deep South Bible Belt, the Bible is 100% literal Baptist type person, you're going to read that and say, oh, that's the way of the world. That's what Satan wants. That's, Moloch is just another form of Satan, obviously, because the world is black and white. There's either Christ and God, or there is Satan, and everybody else's gods are demons or satanic entities. And this was dreamed up by the church fathers, and it sticks around today. But I think that people do definitely put a lot of weight on one people's view in antiquity, and then they project that into their worldview, and it essentially poisons them. I mean, it makes them go mad in many cases. I think there are far more constructive ways to look at the world than to polarize and see things as black and white and binary. And that's what the truther movement does, right? Like, when they say truth, what do they mean? They mean their
truth.
They mean their a priori assumptions, their like epistemological filter. And if you don't see it through their view, then that's not the truth. Well, it's like, sorry, but I don't play like that. Like, I have to see it, and I have to like touch it and feel it and know it to be true. I can't just go on someone's word. And I use my gut instinct, and I try to recreate people's thought process. It's like, where did you go wrong in this way of thinking? And I think it's very easy to become too wrapped up in an illusion when there are actually legitimate problems that need to be dealt with. I'm not saying that like endemic poverty is not a problem, or that widespread terrorism is not a problem, or that there are all manner of problems that are legitimate. But if we say that it's a shadowy cabal of reptilian vampires or something like that, we occult them and we occlude them and we make them not human anymore. They don't have addresses anymore. They don't have zip codes or and these are people. These are human beings who are doing these things. So it's silly to think that it's all going according to plan. To me, it's
indeed. It's whose plan?
Yeah. I mean, I think that people can't even keep an eye on their own spouses, let alone the whole world. And so there's just so many variables at work. And obviously there are so many hands at work trying to acquire power, but the world is equilibrium is attained through universal plunder. So it's like everybody's will to power is concurrently operating, and that is actually what like maintains the world. But everybody's got to play the game, because if you don't, you will suffer. You will fall out of it, and like you will not be able to get back in. And I think that a lot of conspiratorial thinking can lead you astray, rather than benefit you.
Well, it's one of those topics that has no real answer, so there's no real way of knowing, and it's a rabbit hole. And I've mentioned this on my channel numerous times, that all of them, which one, chemtrails, flat Earth, GMO, I don't even know what the newer ones are, 9/11, blah blah blah. They're all valid topics that need investigating, But because there's no valid, definite answers, it will drive you into a feedback loop of insanity. If one, and what my take on it is that, and I mentioned this in a previous video I've made, Prisoners of Technology, that people are giving all their energy in their life to these unanswerable questions, and I feel it could be, whether it's manufactured or not, it's a psychological operation in and of itself, giving your energy and your time to these things that you have no answers for.
Right. Well, and that's the thing too, is that so many of these people, they're like, I'm dedicated to freedom, and I'm dedicated to being liberated, and I'm dedicated, but they've stepped out of one system of control and they've fallen into another one, but one that is particularized rather than collectivized. You're at the whims of every individual person and their individual opinions, and it's very easy to be swayed because, some people have good rhetoric, some people are very charismatic, some people, and that's something that I tried to cover in my series. I think the episode was You Are Being Lied To, and I'm talking about rhetorical devices and sort of what the media does chiefly to lie to you or to convince you to see the world in their way. And there are all sorts of techniques, and these go back to ancient Greece. They had been figured out long, long ago, and they haven't really changed. And somebody who's an agile speaker who's makes good use of the figures of rhetoric can convince people of anything. And this is true of the mainstream media, and it's also true of alternative media. And I think that a lot of people these days, they get this idea in their head that because they are alternative media, because they aren't the mainstream media, that somehow they're right. And it's
absolutely.
And it's like, no, it doesn't work that way. Like, and the other thing is people cast their web too broad, right? Like, you can't be an expert on GMOs, on like 9/11, like steel engineering, on airplane engineering, on chemtrails, on this and that. It's like, you got to pick one thing and you got to research the hell out of it, because otherwise you're just literally going maybe from one YouTube video to another and like picking up the odd eccentricities and then cobbling together the story. And that's just not legitimate research. It's not.
One of the problems I find with the internet is that you can literally make anything you want seem real by spending enough time and going down enough rabbit holes. You can draw correspondences between things that have no correspondence. And, a guilty pleasure of mine is just surfing at a few truther channels, and everything that's red and blue is Masonic, and everything that's black and white is Masonic, and every triangle is the Illuminati eye and all this stuff. And it's just like, there's 5 platonic solids, so we are limited to how many shapes we do have in reality. And if somebody wants to put a triangle on their logo of their photocopying firm, it doesn't mean that they're dancing with Lucifer at midnight,
or pedophiles in a pizza pedophile ring.
So, well, on that topic, what's your take on the whole spirit cooking Pizzagate stuff? Is it art or is it something darker?
I think it's kind of like too edgy for me art, right? Like it's kind of this postmodern anti-art that it started a long time ago. I'm talking about the spirit cooking specifically.
Yeah.
It's got nothing to do with Thelema. Like where in all of the works of Aleister Crowley or does he say that you should do this? Like there's nothing. Like he says, do what you will. And if you're an artist and maybe your will is to shock people and maybe your will is to seduce and create an air of, darkness and occultism. You know what I mean? It's like, it's a marketing ploy. And like, I guess Podesta and his crowd, they all lapped it up. And I don't think that it's necessarily, satanic in the sense that Alex Jones would think of it as satanic. I think it's weird. I'm more into the finer arts. I'm not really a fan of that kind of modern art stuff.
Screaming and throwing menstrual blood around.
Well,
it's high grade. It's high grade.
Yeah. I like screaming. Screaming's fine. Throwing your menstrual blood. I mean, we have natural revulsions to these kinds of things for a reason. They're not, they're not fully artificially constructed. People are like, oh, our level of disgust to various body fluids. These are social constructions. And I'm like, well, no, you don't want to be around other people's feces. You don't want to be around people's vomit. You don't want to be, you don't want some guy coming up and pissing on you. It's just, you don't want to be around other people's bodily fluids because they're not you.
Oh, bless you. You're making my face hurt from laughing here. So we've mentioned Aleister Crowley. We hear a lot of bad things about that. And in the truther world, anyone or anything connected to Crowley is a Satanist, Luciferian.
Right.
And I recently got back into yoga after 15 years hiatus, thanks to the audiobook you produced on Crowley's 8 lectures of yoga. It's remarkably unsatanic.
Of course.
So am I missing something, or is Crowley and his Thelema, what's the story here?
Well, okay. So first off, Crowley was a trickster, right? Like,
yeah,
he was a poet and he was a trickster and a ceremonial magician as well. And poets and tricksters say all kinds of stuff just to get a rise out of people. Like, seriously, if you were to go and read anybody's poetry and take it, even Shakespeare or something, and go and take that literally, are you going to say that, like, oh, Shakespeare, he knew all about witchcraft because there are witches in Macbeth, and he also knew about what it was like to be a woman because he actually was a woman, and that's why he writes really great parts for women, and this, you know what I mean? It's like authors take on various personas, and there's all sorts of things that people attribute to what, well, they cherry pick, and then they say, this is what I want to see him as. Now, I don't think Aleister Crowley was an innocent man. I think that he probably got up to a lot of mischief in his life and probably hurt a lot of people.
As sorry, just to interrupt you, as probably many people would in those circumstances at that time,
right,
under those conditions. It's people seem to forget that if they were in those shoes, they would behave differently. Right.
And I'm sure he wasn't, the easiest person to get along with if you were in his kind of inner circle of friends or whatnot. But I'm interested in his literature and his literary works, and chiefly I'm interested in his work on yoga. That to me, to me, Aleister Crowley is Thelema, the law, which is, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law, love under will. That thing there. And the yoga, that's to me the totality of what I need to know about Aleister Crowley. The rest of it is kind of inconsequential. It's interesting, and I'm interested in his ceremonial magic stuff, but it's mainly his work on yoga that drew me in. And so I think that the problem with, again, the conspiracy theory way of thinking about Aleister Crowley is that you're taking it from the a priori assumption of an evangelical Southern Baptist Christian, where anything that is not Christian is satanic. And so it doesn't matter if it's yoga. Yoga is, to them, the worship of the body, or it's the worship of self. Therefore, it's satanic. because it's not Jesus. Or if it's ceremonial magic, it's satanic because it's forbidden in the Bible. Like, there are very clear injunctions against necromancy, against divination, against ashram worship, against fashioning images, which is a huge part of ceremonial magic. There are all manner of injunctions saying that you can't do this, you can't do that. And so if you're looking at the world from that kind of black and white polarized perspective, and you're free to do so, right? That's part of the beauty of do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, is that you can be a Christian and you can be the best and noblest and kindest and holiest Christian there is and still be a Thelemite. It's just that your will is to love Jesus and your will is to do the right thing and maybe to follow the law and that sort of thing. It's like, but it's ultimately your choice. So it's like there is a response, and there was an older response in the Renaissance, or sorry, not the Renaissance, during the Reformation by a school called Arminianism. And so this was a reaction to Calvinism, because John Calvin, in his reinterpretation of Christianity, thought that what you had were people who were elect, and then you had the rest of the world. And so the elect were people who were predestined from the very beginning, from, the moment that God is eternal, but he always in his mind had his elect with him. And that in the realm of manifestation, we come to realize whether or not we are elect by becoming Christians. And then we either, we go to heaven if we're elect, and we go to hell if we're not elect. And so it was predestined from the very beginning whether people would go to heaven or hell. And so that's John Calvin's, he obviously thought of a lot of other stuff, but that's one of his main philosophical points, is predestination on your salvation. And so Arminianism was a reaction to this, and it was saying that, no, this is about choice. You have a choice to choose Jesus or choose, Baal or whatever. And so it's like, what are you going to choose? And Thelema is a much later, and Rabelais would have been aware of this, and there are various other thinkers. The law of Aleister Crowley can arguably be said to go back to St. Augustine, who said, fac quod vis et dilige, which means do what you will and love. In Latin.
Love it.
Yeah, so
Brilliant.
So it's like, do what you want and love, because if you're loving, then that kind of like governs all of the doing what you will. You're not going to go around hurting things. But then ultimately, Crowley adds love under will. So love is subordinate to your higher will. And so Thelema is a philosophy that is very flexible, and it is a philosophy of free will. It is, I would argue, a libertarian philosophy. And it is, it gives you infinite freedom, but it also gives you infinite responsibility. And I think that is a philosophy that I like to have, even if I'm not necessarily trying to worship Aleister Crowley like some people do. I don't think he was a god. I don't even think he was a particularly good person. I just think that he was a very clever thinker, an extremely well-read gentleman who synthesized a lot of wisdom and knowledge from ancient sources during an era of occult revival. And it could have been somebody else, but it happened to be him. And he did it, and now we're sitting here talking about him.
Absolutely. So what do you make of the conspiracy that he isn't real, that he is an amalgamation of different people and is used as some kind of psychological I've not researched this. I'm just going off of a conversation I had with a friend recently.
This is the first time I've heard this one. This sounds,
yeah, I've not gone
rich.
far enough into it, but it was quite hilarious, considering the person that brought this information to my friend's has some interesting ideas himself. So
yeah, that one that one sounds on par with Alex Jones is Bill Hicks. Those sound like kindred conspiracies.
I saw a picture of one of the people from the Southern Poverty Law Centre, going completely off topic, folks, but he looks like Terence McKenna. Have you seen? Do you know who I'm talking about?
I mean,
the SPLC.
I haven't seen the guy, but I'll take your word for it.
Doppelgangers. It's really, really quite concerning. So what I'm getting from this conversation is that the sort of overriding message is that there's a lot of dogma surrounding the occult and people's opinions of it. People don't want to, or don't look any deeper than just being told that it's satanic or dark or evil or whatever. And it's limiting people's access to it. Can you talk us through what Satanism is? Is it even real? Is it a real thing? Are there Satanists? Is Lucifer worshipped? And if Lucifer's worshipped, who is Lucifer? Can you just give us a quick rundown on that?
Oh, man.
I'd be very grateful.
What a massive topic. Well, okay. First you gotta ask, this is sort of like Islam or Christianity or anything else. You have to ask, who's Satanism, right?
Yeah.
Is it that I am a Christian and I am calling you a Satanist and everything that you do is satanic? Is it that kind of Satanism? Is it the corporate brand name Satanism of Anton LaVey's church, which is basically atheism, plus dress up? Is it the Temple of Set? Is it the Temple of the Black Light? Is it the misanthropic Luciferian order? What are we talking about here? There are an infinite variety of Satanisms, and some of them are as kind of benign as libertarianism, if you will, and then other, or let's say spiritual libertarianism. And then there are other kinds that are like very focused, cultic, grimoire-based, heavily fleshed out kind of Gnostic Satanisms that are like inversions of the kind of stuff that you would read in St. Irenaeus or in the Nag Hammadi libraries, stuff like Qliphothic magic and that sort of stuff. Like you were mentioning that you get a kind of dark vibe from Kabbalah. Well, go look into Qliphothic magic and see what kind of vibe you get from that, and you'll find it's dark. And I mean, inevitably, that kind of magic leads to suicide. Because the point of it is that you're supposed to like get to the height of your strength and then kill yourself in order to escape from the demiurge, and kind of go back into the pleroma of chaos and darkness and nothingness, which is, the true God, not the God of light, who is the false demiurge. And so there are, and this kind of Satanism has nothing to do with the Anton LaVey Satanism. So there's like an infinite kind of array of Satanisms, and it's really difficult to say that there's one kind. I think the popular conception of it, beyond the superficial media popular perception of it, which is like the satanic ritual abuse, the sacrificing virgins and like
Lady Gaga's dreadful video.
Yeah, like
I saw Katy Perry, I think, recently had done some like heavily occulted like music video,
right?
Like similar to Spirit Cooking, essentially.
Right. Well, it's like it's something out of an Iron Maiden song, basically. if you get away from that, like
I really like Iron Maiden.
Me too.
Yeah.
If you get away from that layer and you go kind of a step down, what you'll find is that a Satanist, in the general popular conception, is somebody who is more or less a solipsist or a narcissist or a psychopath or somebody who, and they might not be primary psychopaths, they might not be born psychopaths, but they live their lives like psychopaths in that they don't take into consideration other people's emotions whatsoever. They act with impunity, that sort of thing. And I think that what happens through a process of nominalism is that people extrapolate. They say, okay, a Satanist is somebody who doesn't care about the people around them and is just like, it's kind of like a spiritualized selfishness, right? And then they like go and then they look at, let's say, the CEO of a giant company that's, let's say, running a lumber operation in the Amazon. And they say, well, this person obviously doesn't care about the people around them or the damage that he does. So he's he must be a Satanist. And so, but that's the problem with nominalism, is that you're like making connection, like you're projecting what your definition of a Satanist is. And it's like, he might very well be a Satanist from your black and white perspective, that everybody who doesn't agree with me is Satan, is the adversary, is, you know, that's what Satan means. It really depends on what your starting perspective is. So I kind of have like a polytheistic, sort of like most things, I have a kind of a polytheistic conception of Satanism, where there are like many different Satans, and there are many different ways that Satan is manifest. And some Satans are, you know, these Gnostic Satans. Some are these like Luciferian Satans. And it's just because, you know, so many different people. There's the Satan of John Milton. There's the Satan of the Bible. There's the Satan of various books in the Bible. You know, the Satan in the book of Job is very different from the Satan who tempts Jesus. One is kind of like a lawyer in a king's court, and then the other one is like the ruler of the world. He like owns everything and can like give Jesus all the lands. He makes all these promises because he's literally the king of the world, which we have to escape from through salvation. So it's complicated in that, Satan is not, or Satanism is not so straightforward. And
it's complicated, but you've made it incredibly straightforward, and that's the reason I've got you here, because it's very interesting to hear your take on it, and I'm sure the listeners are really enjoying this. So I'm going to put you on the spot now. The snake on the tree of knowledge, was that Satan, Lucifer, or was that a benevolent force or a malevolent force? Because there's different ways of looking at it, isn't there?
Absolutely. And again, this is who is asking? Are we Sethian Gnostics? If we're Sethian Gnostics, we're going to say that's Christ. Christ is the serpent, and he is defying the demiurge, right? He is defying a Yaltabaoth by giving Adam and Eve whatever that spark of divinity to get them to return to the pleroma and escape from the realm of manifestation. All this you can read about in the Apocryphon of John, by the way. But it's you get different perspectives as well. To the evangelical Christian, like to say my parents' perspective, Satan is undoubtedly the snake on the Satan is undoubtedly the snake on the tree. There's no doubt about that. And if you read it from a strictly historical perspective, that is, you're not bringing to it any kind of a priori spiritual baggage, what you would find after doing enough digging is that this isn't Satan at all. There's no actual proof saying that this serpent is Satan, other than much, much later traditions looking back, such as in the book of Revelations, where it says that Michael and the devil were fighting, and it says that old serpent. So there are equations later in the Bible, which were written hundreds and hundreds of years later, and those are retro-projecting the figure of a more fleshed out, developed figure of Satan into the snake, when at first it's unclear. It doesn't have to be Satan. It can just be man doing his own fall, so to speak.
Okay, that's interesting. So back to what you were saying then about the sort of Christian view that the snake is Satan. Would that lead you to state that the Christians are worshipping the demiurge rather than the creator God? That's a very loaded question. But
it is.
In my mind, that if in the, you say it's Sethian Gnostics would say that the snake was Jesus, and that would be my take. I didn't realize that they said he was Jesus, but it would be my take on it, that if you're bound in that reality, in that creation, and it's been created by the demiurge as a defective plane of existence, and then you're told not to eat, and then the snake comes and offers you knowledge, and you eat and you gain gnosis, then you know that you're defying that demiurge. But if Christians are then turning around and saying no, the snake was Satan, it's disavowing our creator, then surely the Christians are worshipping the demiurge.
Well, when it comes to these kinds of questions and issues, I tend to try to just take a step back and get the full story from both parties, and then kind of withhold judgment. I'm more interested in seeing how these ideas interplay and how they work themselves out in history, rather than
make a binary decision.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Because I find that this idea that the world is created by a demiurge to be very very sexy, very tempting, but also very dangerous. I am not ultimately a proponent of any form of dualism, because I think that you can eventually get so lost in this kind of like imaginary world that you end up like dashing your regular everyday life onto the rocks, and all of these things have to be in accord. They all have to be working harmoniously. It's not one or the other. It's all of it, right? And so that's why I shy away. I mean, I'm very interested in Gnosticism as a historical phenomenon, but to say whether I am a Gnostic, it would be a stretch. I mean, but I also don't want to dismiss their claims. I leave it open as a possibility that maybe that is the case, but it's not something that I accept as an a priori assumption, or that I accept on faith.
No, that's a fair point. I mean, it's more, well, I suppose the statement I made it sound like that was my my take on my beliefs on the
Right.
state of play and the state of existence and creation. It's not. It was more a statement of the way I've interpreted the readings. Is that that the snake is giving man emancipation from that state of existence.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned dualism. Could you just run us through what you mean by that? Because you said you're not a proponent of that. What would be your proposition if you're not proposing dualism?
Well, this is actually, again, insofar as I'm against dualism, I'm also opposed to not I don't reject dualism.
Yeah.
Because I'm not a strict monist. Because if I'm kind of both a monist and a dualist, but I don't settle on either position strictly. It's kind of this non-duality is the position, right?
Yeah.
In monism, all is one mass, all is one, as above, so below. That is an expression that is claiming that what we think of as the above world, that is the intellectual world, the world that is within the mind, and the below world, that is the physical world, the fleshly world. Also, this dichotomy applies to the above world in the sense of the literal heavens, the literal bodies floating around in space, and the below world, which is down here on Earth. What you're saying is what is up there, or what is in the mental place, is the same as there is as is down here. Is that it's all one thing. And now, when you go down the path of dualism, and this is something that I'm trying to flesh out. It's hard to say it very briefly, because this is literally what I'm building a case for throughout Encyclopedia Hermetica. So I'm on part 46 now, and they're each about an hour long, and I'm not even really near scratching the surface of where I want to be in explaining the history of this. But it's like, ultimately, dualism is the idea that there is a human lower realm of material corruption, of decay, essentially, and of transience, and of there's a sort of selflessness of phenomena. And above that, removed from the world of subjectivity, is a pure and objective world that is either the mathematical realm of forms in Plato, or it is the literal heaven of the Christians, It's a realm where you are reconciled with perfection. You cast off your imperfection, your materiality, your corruptibility, and you enter the presence of the One, and therefore you are fulfilled. You are you're in heaven. And so I personally think that it's a very dangerous idea to believe that there is a world after this one that is distinct from this one, and that we should basically punish ourselves or abnegate ourselves in order to acquire mansions in heaven or crowns in heaven. So, whether that's through self-flagellation or whether that's through any sort of self-abnegation, extreme asceticism, extreme fasting, extreme rejection of the world, of society, rejection of the fact that you literally are a body, that is a road to pain and suffering, and there's no guarantee that you actually wind up on the other side as some sort of divine celestial light being that lives in eternal bliss forever. My assumption from my personal experiences is reincarnation. My assumption is that hell is here, is this earth,
Yeah.
and that we are going to come back here over and over and over and over and over again to learn lesson after lesson after lesson. And you can, within that wheel, you can choose to accept it and to rise above it and to, live triumphantly and live proudly and also, live kindly and live in love, but also not live in this basically world-hating, world-denying, misanthropic mode of being, which I think has its origins in Pythagoreanism, in Platonism, in the early church, and it finds itself also outside of the Western tradition as well. In India, there are many groups of people who seek to escape samsara through self-abnegation, through asceticism. The Buddha fought against this. He said, okay, it's not the path to extreme asceticism which leads to enlightenment, but it's also not the path to extreme, let's say, aestheticism, as in aesthetics. These are like two opposites on a pole, and the middle path is the way to go.
The middle path, yeah, absolutely.
And so, I'm not a monistic thinker. I'm not a dualistic thinker. I'm a non-dual thinker, if you will. And I think that this conception of thinking is reconcilable with all kinds of belief systems. I think that for me, the best way to behave or the best way to be a good person is to assume that other people are me in another life. And it's like when you understand that, it's a lot easier to do kind things or to do the right thing, at least.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thanks for sharing those insights. I really like the observations there. It's a good explanation, because dualism can mean different things to different people.
Right.
And often people look at duality and they limit that frame of reference to just life here on Earth and the duality we see in nature, hot and cold, wet and dry,
right,
day and night. And that duality then is another trap to keep them in without thinking about the dual aspect, like you say, of the plane of existence of Earth and the heavens and the interplay between the two.
Right. I should say also, probably when most people say dualism, they aren't meaning what I'm necessarily meaning. They could be meaning Manichaeanism in the abstract sense of the word, like things are black and white, not in the literal religious sense of the term, which is also dualistic. But or they're thinking in the modern philosophical sense of Cartesian dualism, which was brought about by the philosophy of René Descartes, who thought that the mind and the body were two distinct things. There was a body, and then there was this kind of like epiphenomenal consciousness that was actually the soul, and it sat at the heart of your pineal gland, and that when you died, the soul kind of separated from the body and carried on, whereas the body fell apart and decayed. Well, that flies in the face of all sort of neuroscientific understandings of how the brain-body complex works. And so mind-body dualism in philosophy is no longer a tenable argument. It's no longer really a way that people think, at least in philosophy departments, in neuroscience departments. And so that's usually what people think of when they think of dualism. But all of these things, they tie into one another, right? Like Descartes didn't just like come up with this overnight. He had a rich tradition which he was aware of and that he was drawing on from in his ideas. And it's only very recently that we've come to, again, that science has come to realize some of the alchemical dreams, which is that all is one. So in the same way that the Hadron Collider found the Philosopher's Stone, if you will, to make gold, lead into gold, they also collapsed the mental and the physical into one great thing. And so that's another thing that we can celebrate science for. You know, despite its many failings, it has many, many triumphs. And you know, I am a great fan of the scientific endeavors of the modern world.
I am, and I mean, I do bash
within
it,
limits.
But... Yeah, exactly, and that's the thing. I make a criticism, and people are like, oh! And it's like, look, medicine is really, really useful, okay, and all of this stuff is really useful. But there's dogma, there's polarization, there's too much money involved in it. There's too many ways for it to be corrupted.
Yep.
Same with everything.
Yep.
And so people need to try and be aware of that, because what is it? Neil deGrasse Tyson, somebody I cannot stand. Don't like the bloke.
Me neither.
I just don't like him. But what is it he says? I've even seen it on a bloody T-shirt. What is it? The good thing about science is it's true whether you believe it or not. And it's like, well, this is rich coming from tradition that has a variable speed of light. People don't even realize the speed of light varies.
It could be.
Like,
we just don't. We have no way of knowing because we haven't been measuring it long enough.
Yeah, so you know, there's from the outset, there's lots of sort of little discrepancies that ring alarm bells for me. But people are more than happy to put their tuppence worth in the pot. And you know, I'm digressing a bit, but it's when I criticize science, it's not criticizing the magical endeavors and saving people's lives and bringing people out of poverty. I'm criticizing these dogmatic individuals,
absolutely,
spinning yarns for their own end.
Yep. Yeah, it's like when science starts to look like religion, it starts to get criticized, and rightfully so, I think.
And that's back to what you said in our correspondence, that, you know, conspiracy theories are religion for depressed people.
Yeah, unfortunately.
So, how are you for time?
I'm great. We can keep going.
Okay, cool. It'd be good if we can. I'm really, really enjoying this. It's as long as you're happy, it's great, because I've got a few more things I'd like to discuss, and I'm learning so much. It's fantastic. So, we did digress there a little bit, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for sticking with us. I hope you're enjoying this. Again, thanks to Dan for being here. It's a fantastic learning opportunity for myself, and I'm hoping that all our listeners are enjoying this as well. So, back to the sort of main topic of conversation. We hear a lot about solar cults and sun worship in both truth and conspiracy circles. One of the main premises, or one of the most famous memes, is that we are enslaved as a species by a small minority of elites worshipping a solar cult. Now, I do a lot of work with the sun. It's a big part of my focus, and it's something that drew me into this practice, the sun and the teachings around the sun. But I'm always keen to point out that the sun is the vehicle, not the god, so to speak. And if don't idolize the thing it conveys, maybe would be a better description. So I wondered if you could sort of talk a little bit about solar cults and, you know, the origins, the emanations of them. Do you think the elites worship a solar cult? And if so, why?
I'm going to say, like, right off the get-go, no. Unless you are equivocating solar cult or dark solar cult, as I've heard it, or Saturnine cult, which is like the black sun. And it's like those are all co-equivocated together. I don't think that actually is a thing unless you mean it to mean the cult of the self. Because in traditional astrology, the sun is often understood of as the ego, as pride, as the kind of exuberant self at the center of all things. And if you mean the worship of the self in its exuberance, then I do think that there, most people, let's say, are solar cult worshippers. But again, this is through a process of equivocation and extrapolation. I don't think that at an a priori level there are black Saturnine cults or whatnot at work. I think that people are projecting their inner landscapes onto the outer world because, again, conspiracy theories are like religion for depressed people. And that being said, to say that people haven't historically or even still that they don't worship the sun is ridiculous. Obviously, there's people who they're solar worshippers or solar cults, but the thing is that most of these, historically and today, they don't worship the actual planet, the sun. I mean, I think that that's probably evident to most people. They worship the sun as a principle. They kind of abstract it as like, okay, what is the sun of the sun? And it's like that. They worship the sun as this kind of divine emanation, this body of energy that provides for all of us. But that is the universe. It's kind of like it's the universe through the sun, and that is our particular manifestation in our little block, our little corner of the Milky Way, and our little corner of the universe. But it's the thing that gives us all life, and so it's really when you're worshiping the sun as a monolithic entity, you're worshiping the source of all things. You're worshiping. You're trying to get back to the root of it all. And I think that's great. That's what Akhenaten tried to do. It didn't work out too well for him. He got assassinated by all the Egyptian priests because
right, okay,
because he put them out of a job by saying there was only one god. He put the entire kind of temple industry and priest complex of Egypt in peril, and you can't do that. So unless you get everybody on board, which was the case in terms of Judaism, but even then, it's like they went a step further and they're like, no, we're not going to worship the sun because that's creation. It's like in the right there in the beginning of Genesis, he's creating the sun. So you're not going to worship the thing that was created. You're going to go to the creator. But it's a cop-out. It's a blind-sighted interpretation of what people mean when they worship the sun, that they aren't worshiping the physical creation, rather the thing that is behind it. But other than that, yeah, I don't really buy any of this black Saturnine cult stuff. I mean, people say like, oh, look at academia and they wear black robes, and look at the judges and they wear black robes, and look at like cops all dressed in black. It's a giant Saturnine cult. And it's like, okay, well, you're just like, that's cherry picking. Who cares? I dress in black. I'm not part of a Saturnine cult.
But that's the level of discourse on YouTube. Honestly,
I know.
See it. I said it earlier that, look, red, right, must be a Freemason. Yeah. What's a fucking colour, mate?
Yeah.
It's like... And this goes back to all the people I know the people that you're talking about black square mortarboards and black this and black that and black squares and black cubes. I know who they are, and they're people that make money from talking about this stuff. They don't debunk it. They don't try and actually spread truth. There's no truth there. It's their dogma, their little area, and there's so much just so much misinformation. And that was one of the reasons I wanted to make this video, have this conversation with you, was to just kind of try and debunk some of this stuff. And we can draw you said it yourself, you can become schizophrenic by drawing correspondences with everything. Look, there's a bird on the table, the bird's looking at me, it must be communicating with me.
Right.
I want to try and give people, and that's what I hope we're doing, is break this down and say, look, this is nonsense. This is absolutely nonsense.
Well, it's funny. I saw this one I don't know, guy or girl who posts on Twitter, and they posted a picture, and it was it was 2 panels, and on the left panel it said it was a bunch of dots, and then it said information on the top. It was a bunch of dots, and then on the right all the dots were connected, and then it said knowledge. Well, my friend took that picture and he scrubbed out the knowledge part, and so on the left there were these disconnected dots, and it said information, and on the right there were all the dots were connected, and then it just said paranoid delusion. So it's like, where is, like, that? There's an extremely fine line between knowledge and paranoid delusion, and like, when you're paranoid and deluded, other people's knowledge looks like paranoid delusion to you. So you're like, oh, everybody else is a sheep. Everybody else has been brainwashed. They're all cattle. Like, they don't believe in the same exact conspiracy theories that I do because they're mind controlled. And it's like, well, from my perspective, you're mind controlled. It's like you've been brainwashed by a bunch of people with personal agendas. So it's,
I'm laughing because it's something I've seen recently, where these channels are just telling everybody else who's not in their like clique of 2 or 3 channels that they're all shills.
Yeah, of course.
And there's just these wars going back and forth, and it's just like,
it's clickbait.
It's clickbait, but it's also it's quite sad, really, that so many people are giving their time and energy, and this is why the conspiratorial side of me thinks that, oh boy, they are doing the work of the cultural engineers, the dumbing down of people, getting them to just go down these rabbit holes and just bloody stay there, arguing about each other's legitimacy and drawing all these parallels. It's a concern because it draws people in, and by God, it's nearly drawn me in a couple of times.
Right.
Because you feel empowered. It fires off your neurons. It drops the dopamine when you start finding out forbidden knowledge, and when you start looking at these things and you feel naughty. And
yeah, well, it creates an us and them and like an in-group where it's like, and that's my problem with things like Gnosticism, right? It's like, we have the hidden inner knowledge and everybody else is. Well, I'm like, well, everybody says that. Like, it doesn't matter if you're Jehovah's Witness or if you're like a Zen Buddhist or if you're some rishi on a mountain. Like, everybody claims that they have the truth and that everybody else is ignorant. So it's like, well, I'm just going to have to figure things out for myself.
It's a good. I like that attitude. It's a good thing, and that's how I feel about my sort of path. It's pragmatic. Sometimes I get duped. I try to. Now, was it Terence McKenna or was it Robert Anton Wilson that said, "I don't believe in anything, but I have my suspicions"?
Yeah, I think that's Robert Anton Wilson.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm sure they both expressed the sentiment in various words. I feel the same way. That's like reincarnation, right? Like, I don't believe in it in the sense that I, beyond a shadow of a doubt, can 100% say that it's true, but I have very strong suspicions that it is the case.
So something I wanted to talk to you about then, we talked about one God sort of monism. Where does sort of pagan and shamanic practice sit in with this idea? Because if there is one creator God, does offering does providing offerings to lesser deities, small g gods, does that anger the large god, or is it part of that process of being grateful and respectful to everything? Because that's what it feels like for me. I'm very rural here, and I've got a deep connection with my garden and plants and veg and trees and birds, and it's getting deeper and deeper and deeper as I go on, especially with the yoga and stuff, which I could talk to you about for hours. What's the kind of view on this? Would you say a pantheistic outlook?
Well, See, here's the thing: is that we often think in opposing camps. So we think of like monotheism was the Judeo-Christian model, and you have paganism, which was the classical Greco-Roman model, and that or Germanic or Egyptian or whatever, Near Eastern, and that the monotheistic model won out over the pagan model, and then that was that. Well, it wasn't so clear-cut and simple. Most polytheistic or pagan models, over time, they become so baroque that they eventually have to simplify themselves, and they often do create a sort of one god, a sort of principle from which all other gods participate in. And, you know, in Hinduism, this is like Brahma, and in the Greco-Roman world, they just call it the one, or they called it straight up God, Dios. And this is actually, this was a big thing in Stoicism, because Stoicism was largely the religion practiced by the intellectual elites of, say, Rome. And so they were pagan in the sense that they didn't deny that there were other gods, and they would partake in the daily functions. They would sacrifice, they would do the festivals, they would do the practical dimension of it. But ultimately, they said its virtue is the highest good, and really what I'm kind of contemplating is the highest God, is the one, is the all. And so you get buildings like the Parthenon, the Pantheon, my apologies, in Italy, or in Rome. So the way that the building is designed is to let in sunlight, but no matter how long you stand inside the Pantheon, you won't ever see the sun directly. You'll only ever see it obliquely. And so it's this dome with, you know, many squares kind of shrinking down into this dome with more rarefied number of squares until you reach this one oculus, this eye, through which the sun shines through. But you'll never see it directly. You can only see it obliquely. And so the idea is that the one can be seen through the many, but that we need not cast away the many because it is just the one, because it's not just the one, it's the one and the many. It's this non-dual position. And then it was that position, that kind of Stoic interpretation of the religious landscape, permeated the Greco-Roman world, and it acted as a bridge for Christianity to creep in. You know, the women and the slaves first believed in the God of Isaac and Jacob and Abraham and so forth, and they gradually convinced their masters. The political power grew, and it spread, and that was largely how a Christianity emerged. If there hadn't been this propensity toward monotheism in the philosophical pagan mind, it's likely that Christianity would not have won. So it was a very gradual rarefaction into principles. And you'll see this in Plotinus, in Iamblichus especially. Iamblichus's work was all about intellectualizing the pagan world and saying this is not country bumpkin practice. Remember, the word pagan means country dweller. It's related etymologically to the French paysan or the English peasant. So pagan means peasant. And so he's saying, hold on, it's a derogatory term made up by Christians who were all living in cities. So the cities were Christianized, but the outsides, the countrysides, were still pagan. And so they would say, oh, look at these rustic folk, these simple peasants, and their peasant religion. How quaint. And so you have people in late antiquity like Iamblichus writing in defense of these people, saying, no, this is sophisticated, and this is thousands of years of tradition, and this is not fairy tales and wives' tales. This is very deep stuff, and it has to do with the mind, and it has to do with emanations from the one and how we can reconnect to the one through the middleman of the mind, or through the spirits. And so it was very complicated, but it wasn't just like a Christianity versus paganism narrative. It was a slow kind of domino effect from the multiplicitous animistic reality of everything has a god to, well, if everything has a god, maybe all of these gods are, well, and they're lesser than, let's say, the Olympian gods, because those are great gods. Well, then there are things above them and things below them, and there's this whole hierarchy. So there's this golden chain of being, and it's called, you can look it up, it's called Homer's Golden Chain. And that is, that this was this idea that you have the one at the top, and from the one descends progressive stages of emanation, and that what the wise man wants to do is, instead of spending most of his time in the world below, he should be contemplating higher things and be going back to the one. And so the difference between the Neoplatonists and the Gnostics like were really religious about it, and so they were very much into like we were discussing, self-abnegation, asceticism, and these sorts of things. And the Neoplatonic approach was to say, no, it's not about rejecting this world to get back to the one. It's about finding your place in this world. That's how you get back to the one. You reconnect through union, through yoga, not through denial or through like chastisement of your body at the expense of your soul. And in short, that's one way to look at it.
So does Homer's golden chain relate to the sort of tree of life in the Kabbalah? Would that be that similar process of emanation? Would that be a good analogy for people that might not be familiar with it? Because I've not ever heard of Homer's golden chain, but I'm familiar with the emanatory aspect of the tree of life.
Yeah. What you might know it as is the great chain of being, and that's kind of often taught in high schools even when people teach Shakespeare. Because if you don't have the Elizabethan worldview down pat, a lot of Shakespeare just doesn't make sense. So, you've got to learn that, like, there are four humors, and that the four humors are governed by the relationship of the planets, and that the planets, that these things are determined at your birth, and that the stars pour in and are, their energies are kind of warped by the positions of the planets, and then these will determine what your nature is like, and that's fate, and there's nothing you can do about fate, and that's why you have tragedies and comedies and things like that, because they're playing with this idea of fate. But yeah, so it's this idea that at the top you have the one, and this is the Christianized conception, right? The medieval Christianized conception. It comes from Dionysius the Areopagite. And before him, from a kind of Platonic and from Judaic literature, is where he got these ideas that you have at the top, you have God, and then below him you have seraphim or archangels and seraphim and cherubim and saints and various kind of powers and principalities and thrones and virtues. And then as you move down that into the realm of manifestation, down, sort of like in Kabbalah, down from Keter, down toward Malkuth, you get into grosser and grosser, or let's say denser and denser states. So you start to get the planets, which are conceived of as still crystalline energy light bodies, at least until Galileo gets a telescope and looks at the moon and says, hey, look, there's craters on this thing.
Don't you know it's a hologram?
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah. No, the reptilians set it up. Galileo's
it's got Nazis.
For
There's
NASA.
Nazis hiding there as well.
Yeah. Well, yeah, on the dark side, right.
Yeah.
Is the dark side holographic or not? Like, how do they hide on the holograph?
Which
one's true?
There, but yeah.
But yeah, so you descend through the planets, and then eventually you get to the elemental realm. So there were four elements: earth, wind, fire, and water, and these composed all things in various configurations. And so then you get a chain of being which goes down and then back up. So it's sort of like it goes mineral, vegetable, animal, and then rational human. And the idea is to climb up that ladder. And so you get all these beautiful drawings in, say, Dante, or it's Gustave Doré's drawings of Dante's Inferno, and he very, I think, aptly illustrates these concepts of, angels upon angels swarming around this light being. It's all leading your eyes into the one thing, which is this boundless and kind of unquenchable light. And that's a conception of God. And so we are, and you know what? It's like, this relates back to our conversation about science and magic and when it became divorced and so forth. It's like, this was the worldview before the scientific enlightenment. But there's a lot of but the scientific enlightenment had to use that worldview as a springboard. And there's actually probably a lot of things that they kept, not actually probably, I know for a fact there's a lot of things that they kept, and while they were kind of cutting off the dross. So obviously something that they kept, for example, was they got rid of the geocentric model, and then they brought in the heliocentric model. Well, that's great, but in terms of like navigation, in terms of actually like in practice, they kept all the tools, the measurement tools, which imply a perspective-centric or geocentric model, because that's what works in actuality. Like, maybe in the objective world, the sun flies around, or everything flies around the sun, but in the subjective world, that's not much use to me. Unless I'm launching spaceships out into space, right? Like, an astrolabe functions on the principles of a flat Earth and a domed firmament and that sort of thing. By the way, not that anybody believed in flat Earth in the past.
Well, this is something that's come to my attention, is that I've heard many conflicting stories that point of view never did exist. It's something that's reasonably new. Am I right? Wrong? I mean, it's a huge topic. And
what, the whole like flat Earth with the dome and the Aristotelian system? Well, it's that there are various, like in ancient Greece, there were all manner of debates as to whether, like, how to measure things, but most of the measurements took into consideration that the Earth was round, was a globe. They just misunderstood the size of it, right? There was a period where, if you're drawing it and you're representing it, it makes sense to, like, because if you stand in the middle of a field and you look around you, it looks like a disc with a dome on top, right? So if you're like drawing that and you want to convey that, it's easier to just draw a plate with a dome over it, than it is to draw like a giant globe and position yourself in that. But there was in the Semitic worldview, the idea of a kind of like disc in like a dinner plate in space, and then you would go to Sheol, which was like beneath the earth. Sheol basically means the grave. It's not so much, and that's the same thing with Valhalla as well. If you really start digging into real Norse stuff, you'll find that like Valhalla is not really a place you go to fly with Valkyries and eat and fight and whatever. It's like actually they're Indo-Europeans who believe in reincarnation, and Valhalla just means the grave. But, I don't want to get too detracted with flat Earth, because there's only so much I can say about it. Yeah.
And they do, isn't there there's a passage in Blake's Milton, isn't there, where he essentially describes what you've just said. When a man stands and surveys his universe, he bears witness to a flat disc around him and a domed canopy, tabernacle, whatever you want to call it, to his
firmament,
his existence. And it is our perspective. And you are right that actually sometimes we need to operate on what's true in our reality right now, not what's maybe true in the textbooks and the science books.
Well, that leads me into saying, I don't want to get too much onto the flat Earth thing, but I think that this is where flat Earth stems from, is that centuries ago, all you knew was what you knew, right? Most people were illiterate. They didn't have television. They didn't have, some of them went to church, and so they had the church telling them stuff. But it's like most of your understanding came from your first-person experience.
Yeah.
Nowadays, very little of the information you get comes from first-person experience, and so it's easy for you to doubt everything. And so once you get into this like rabbit hole of doubting everything, because you aren't actually experiencing anything first person anymore, because you live in a kind of matrix-like larval state at a computer or at a television or just in society in general, where you're always being kind of projected with information, you have no way of verifying it all, so you just got to take it on kind of faith. And then you're like, well, what if this was a lie and that was a lie, so maybe it's all a lie. And then you start thinking like, oh yeah, the earth is flat. And
that's a really good observation.
And there's no coming back from that, right? Like that's terminal.
It really concerns me, the lack of, back to that video, Prisoners of Technology, the lack of present moment experience. People are much happier to just look to a screen for the answers rather than engaging with reality. And
right.
It's going to cause so many problems in the future. I dread to think what it's going to be like. I really do.
And I mean, the future is now, so there's already crazy stuff going on.
Oh, mate, I know. And, and this is, again, one of the spurring on for the conversation is that I've just seen so many things recently that have just made me think, oh my God, if people are believing this, we are fucked.
Yep.
We are in so much trouble. And the infighting in the communities and the people who are supposed to be working for truth just bitching and fighting, and it's hilarious. And so I'm really grateful to you, Dan, for coming on the channel and having a chat with me about all of this stuff. This feels like a good point to sort of end our conversation. We've covered all of the points and more that I'd intended to go through this afternoon. So look, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, mate, it's been a long time coming. And again, I'm very grateful to you for your patience with me, because my health has been particularly challenging. And I know you've been hanging on, waiting for this conversation to happen. So thank you for your patience. And we are going to hopefully have another conversation like this in the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there we have it, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much to Dan Attrell for coming on the channel for the first episode of Interconnected. I really did have a blast. It was great talking to you, Dan, and I've learnt so much. It's been fantastic. If I can ask the audience to please check out Dan's website. He can be found at themodernhermeticist.com and also on YouTube by either typing Modern Hermeticist into the search bar or going to youtube.com/user/arcesum, ARCESSEEUM, spell all one word. So again, thank you all for watching. Be sure to interconnect with your higher selves and stay happy, healthy and peaceful. An understanding. So really, the two were quite heavily entwined for quite some time, science and magic, because the origins have got to be, for Hermetic thought, pre-Christ at least. So
right,
what are we looking at as a timescale for them being linked before they diverged?
Well, what I should say is that it's the divergence is in our heads. It's an artificial one. It's kind of like a label that we impose from the outside in. Science, what it is that science had a changing definition. So science to the ancient world didn't mean empiricism. It didn't mean the collection of data in order to prove hypotheses, that sort of thing. It wasn't the scientific method. What we were looking at was scientia in Latin, where the word science comes from, means knowledge. So it was the collective body of knowledge of the world. I mean, largely of your language, but whatever had been translated into your language. So, say Greek, whatever most people were reading in Greek in the ancient world. And so they were translating all manner of scientific, magical, philosophical, natural philosophical, which is what we call science today. All of these things were being translated into Greek. And so you would read all of this stuff and get a complete vision of the world. And then you would say, okay, that's science. That's the collective body of human understanding. It wasn't a method like it is today. Now, it was during the Enlightenment that came about, that scientific method was developed in order to differentiate the new sort of science, the new kind of mode of understanding from that old kind of dusty, curmudgeonly, academic tradition of Aristotelian scholasticism, of sort of reconciling new discoveries with old traditions. And it was always about reconciling with tradition. And this new mode wanted to break away from that entirely. So it created a system for itself. And then we had two different meanings for the word science. We had science, the method, and then we had science, which was still the old meaning of the word, the body of understanding. And we still kind of have a holdover of this when we say, like, oh, this is science, like, this is fact, this is science. Like, that means to say, not that I have, like, tested this and probed this through experimentation and I know it to be true. What you're saying is somebody else has and I'm taking their word for it.
I see.
So it's the changing definitions that we have to think of, and when that happened, more so than when magic and science actually became divorced from one another, because in some ways they never became divorced, and in some ways, they remain legitimate intellectual pursuits. I think of the Large Hadron Collider.
Plus rhetoric. So I wanted to get you on as one of the foremost authorities on history, mysticism, and the occult to talk us through some of the more popular memes that we see emanating from the rabbit hole of YouTube for people that are looking and searching for truth. So firstly, please, can you give us a quick history lesson as to the connection that magic has to science?
Right. So, this is a difficult question to answer in a way that is brief, but I would say that it's probably easier to tell you when science and magic became disentangled, because for so long they were one and the same thing. It was during the Enlightenment that sort of old notions of magical thinking, things like sympathetic resonances and that sort of astrological dimension of natural philosophy, all that was being shed. This is where you get the split or the divorce between alchemy and chemistry. Alchemy falling largely out of favor because it had been overrun by frauds who were looking to make a quick buck by getting their patron to fund them to find the Philosopher's Stone. I don't want to paint them too negatively, though, because they also did a lot of science, right? So alchemists were in the forefront, let's say, in the Holy Roman Empire, of mining operations, of metallurgical research, and also even weapons manufacturing and these sorts of things. So it's not so easy to say when magic stops being science, but I would say that around the Enlightenment, we get a gradual sort of disillusionment with the traditional magic worldview of the Middle Ages, which had been inherited from the Greco-Roman world before it.
So what kind of time period are we talking about when you say the Enlightenment?
Well, we're talking about 18th century chiefly. Starting in the 17th century, very much so, but culminating in the 18th century. And then that would give way to sort of romanticism that would bring back a lot of interest in the foreign, the exotic, and, of course, the occult. and Romanticism would be sort of the main lifeline into Victorian occultism, the revival of Victorian occultism, and that is in large part at the root of the occult, let's say, revival of the 20th century.
And the Western esoteric tradition would come under that umbrella.
Right. I mean, the Western esoteric tradition is very long and convoluted and has Celsus in there, Agrippa in there, you can put Marsilio Ficino and Giordano Bruno and all of these people who are definitely not Victorian era occultists, but these are people who, they're the tradition, they're the canon, they're the people that other people would go to get an understanding of that sort of lost ancient wisdom of medieval magic.
So it really, I mean, if to give our listeners Dan, thank you so much for joining us here at Interconnect. You are a long-term subscriber, and I thank you for all the support you have given the channel and the time you've taken on multiple occasions now to make this conversation work. So thank you for that. Welcome to Interconnect. How are you today?
I'm well. Thanks for having me, Ollie.
So, in our correspondence during the preamble to this recording, you said something that really struck a chord with me, and that is conspiracy theory is like religion, but for depressed people.
Yes.
Now, the whole idea of this discussion was inspired by a common narrative that spreads through truther and conspiracy channels on YouTube, and your comment absolutely hit the nail on the head. Now, these channels and movements seem to thrive off the idea that the occult is satanic, is evil, and that quote-unquote magic practice is used by powerful elites to enslave mankind. I am paraphrasing, but you get the idea. Now, I've digested quite a lot of both occult and conspiracy information, and I find some discrepancy here. The truther movement, conspiracy movement, is really depressing. Like you say, everything's doom and gloom. We're trapped in hell. Don't go outside because the apocalypse is just around the corner. It's best if you just stay in and watch more of my videos. So we hear an enormous amount about solar cults, Luciferianism, Freemasonry from those truther channels, but very little as to actually how to improve one's life or get out of the matrix, to use a cliche. When we look at esoterica, the opposite's true. There's a whole swathe of literature on self-improvement, altruism, transcendence, compassion. My own practice has undoubtedly made me a better person and led me to grow and shed both addictive and destructive behaviour traits, which leads me to question the agenda of these so-called truthers. Do they want to help people change, improve, emancipate themselves and know truth, or are they simply there to depress and disempower with empty hope